Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of the Search and Rescue Wood Stories. I hope you're prepared not to sleep tonight, and if you're watching this too late, I recommend closing the closet doors and checking under the bed once or twice. A lot of people compare these to the David Pollard stories, Missing 411. I'm sure if you are a forest enthusiast, you must have heard a thing or two about them. But don't worry, these are not a ripoff of David Pollard's. These are this search and rescue officer's personal experiences. Shall we begin? There was a lot of feedback about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly here. And I'll also include a story. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are pretty dilapidated. Others are just ruins, but there are more still that are brand new. I saw one set that looked like they came from a lighthouse. They were metal and spiral, almost old-fashioned. The stairs don't go up infinitely, or farther than the eye can see. But some are definitely taller than others. As was mentioned before, just imagine the stairs in your house as if they had been copy and pasted right out into the middle of the wood. There are no photos of them. It never occurred for me to take any pictures, and I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I'll try again in the future maybe, but I can't really promise anything. A few people expressed confusion about the guy with no face. Just to clarify, when the climber ascended and reached the top of the peak, there was another man there, in a parka and ski pants. This was the man with no face. And now on to the newer stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The other are just rescue calls. People who slide down a cliff and get hurt or injured by fire. You wouldn't believe how often this happens with stupid, drunk kids. They get bitten or stung by animals or insects. We're a tight team, and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes these cases where we never find a trace of them so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us, because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home. She was concerned because he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and had suffered one out on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't even go with him. I don't ask about that thing because past a certain point, it doesn't really matter. Someone is missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that this man had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure that we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call comes over the radio, telling us to head back to the vet. And we come right away, because this usually means the missing person is injured, and we need all hands on deck to get them out safely. We meet back up, and the vet is standing at the base of the tree with his hands kind of on the sides of his head. I ask him what's going on, and he points up the tree to this branch. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. But there's a walking stick dangling up above, at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle was just looped around it, hanging there. There's no way this guy could have tossed it that far up, and we don't see any other sign that he's still in the area. We call up into the trees, but it's obvious no one's in it. We're just all left sort of scratching our heads. We keep searching for the man, of course, but we never find him. We even bring our canines out, but they lose the scent long before this tree. Eventually, the search is called off, because there are other calls we have to attend to, and past a certain point there isn't really anything we can do. Guy's wife called us every day for months, asking if we'd found her husband. and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it was the sheer improbability of it. That and the questions that were raised. How did his cane get up there? Did someone kill him and toss that there as some weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. Doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy. And we always dread the ones we find dead. It's not common, but it does happen. David Pollards talks a lot about kids' SAR teams, finding them in places they shouldn't or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I'll share one that I think about a lot as I witness this personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other is about 3. She's watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never lets them out of her sight. But that's what they all say. There was never anyone in the area either, which is important to the case. She packs up their stuff, and they start heading back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost from the parking area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Please remember to always stay on the trails. Her kids are walking in front of her when she hears what sounds like someone coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in the 4 seconds or so that she's not looking, the 5-year-old vanishes. She figures he stepped off the trail to pee. But when she asks the other kids where he went, they both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them and took the kid by the hand, leading him into the tree line. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it seems like they've been drugged. They're all sort of spacey and fuzzy. So of course she freaks out. She starts looking frantically in the area for her kid, screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer. Now obviously she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got 2 other kids. So she calls the police, who send us out immediately. We respond, and we start searching for him. Over the course of the search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of him. The dogs don't pick up any scent, and we don't find any clothing or broken bushes or anything that could signify a child being there. Of course, we have our suspicions about the mother, but considering how distraught she was, we didn't think it was her. The volunteers keep searching, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needs to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figured it has to be a different kid. We go out there, about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I've been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did since we found him, and I've never come up with an answer. There was a volunteer just in the area, because he figured he may as well look in places that no one else would think to, on the off chance that the body had been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed in a little opening in the rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so we know right away who it is. That's when he calls it in and we are dispatched. It took us almost 3 hours to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he'd started, but there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. The slope is treacherous, and it's hard for even us with our climbing gear to get him. The 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there, that I'm certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty. It wasn't as if an animal had dragged him up there, and from what we can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He'd been out here for over a month by that point, but he looked like he'd only been dead for a day or 2 at most. The whole thing was unbelievably strange, and It was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever had the displeasure of attending. We found out later that the coroner determined that the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death probably late at night 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest cases I've been on. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old that had gotten separated from his mom. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were strong on his scent, and we saw clear signs that he had been in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about a half a mile from where he was last seen. He wasn't even aware that he'd wandered that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for because I'm not all that good with kids, and I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me one of the hot spots. This is usually where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. We hike out there, just a few miles away, and we get there in about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area and she's pointing out places she's found people in the past, but I see something in the distance. Now this is an area where about 8 miles from the main parking lot. There's back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we're on state-protected land, which means that there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower or a makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with. But I could see from here that whatever this thing is, it has straight edges. And if there's one thing you learn quickly, nature rarely makes straight lines. I point it out, but my trainer doesn't say anything. She just hangs back and lets me wander over and check it out like a curious dog. I get within about 20 feet of it, and all the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's a staircase in the middle of the woods. In the proper context, it would be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase with beige carpeting and about 10 steps tall. But instead of being in a house where they should be, it's out in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see the wood it's made of. Almost like a video game glitch, where the rest of the house has failed to load completely and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stand there and it's like my brain is working in overtime to try to make sense of just what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me. He just stands there casually, looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her what's going on and what it's doing there, but she just laughs. Get used to it, rookie. You're gonna see a lot of them. I start to move closer, but she grabs my arm. I wouldn't do that, she says. Her voice is casual, but her grip is tight, and I stand there looking at her. You're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. And don't go up them. Just ignore them. I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she's looking at me tells her that it's best if I don't. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right, though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. But sometimes they're 20 or 30 miles out, in the middle of nowhere, and I only find them during the broadest searches or training weekends. They're almost always in good condition, but sometimes they look like they've been out there for a while. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion, and were at least 10 feet wide with steps leading up at least 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking with people about it, but they just give me the same response my trainer did. It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal. But don't go close to them or up them. When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. This is another one that's less spooky and more on the sad side. A young man went missing late in the winter, when, realistically, no one should be out that far on the trail. We close a lot of them, but some remain open year-round unless there's a ton of snow. We didn't opt for him, but he had about 6 feet of snow on the ground. It was an unusually heavy snow. And we knew it wasn't likely that we'd find him until the spring thaw came. Sure enough, when the first big thaw hit, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the trail. We found him at the base of a tree in a pile of melted snow, and I knew right away what had happened. And it scared the living daylights out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or spend any amount of time in the mountains will probably have guessed what happened by now. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath the branches. This happens most with fir trees, because they have a closed umbrella sort of shape. So what you end up with is space around the base of the tree. It's filled with a mixture of loose, powdery, snowy air and branches. These are called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the welcome center. Big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are, but every year we get an unusual amount of snow, and at least one person doesn't read them or doesn't take the warning seriously. And we find out about it in the spring. My best guess is that this young man went hiking and got tired, or maybe he had a cramp from walking deep in the snow. He went to go sit at the base of the tree, not knowing there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck with his feet up, and the surrounding snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen except in deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position like this guy did, even 6 feet can be lethal. What scared me the most was imagining how he must have struggled. Upside down in the freezing cold, surely he didn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him. It would have been literally impossible to get out. As it got harder to breathe, he would have known what was happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. And now, for the final story. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the goat man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never had anything quite like that happen. The closest I could say is the black-eyed man thing from the last video. But I didn't see anything. However, there was one call where I had something kind of similar happen. But I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the goat man. In a report that an older woman had fainted on one of the trails and needed some assistance getting back to the main area. We hiked up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs, or, well, jogs to us, and tells us that a little ways off the trail, there's something. And his wife starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her, and she's passed out on the trail. We get her on a backboard, and as we're getting her down to the welcome center, she comes and starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask what happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, but essentially, she'd been waiting for her husband. But she started to hear a strange sound. A cat, but it was off somehow. She couldn't quite figure out why. She went a little ahead to try and hear it better, and it sounded like it was coming closer. She said that as she got closer to it, the more uneasy she felt, until she finally figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part because it was so weird I don't think I could forget if I tried. It wasn't a cat, it was a man, saying the word meow over and over again. Just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man, it couldn't have been. Because I've never heard a man make a buzzing noise like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it. It sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him. And the closer he got, the more scared I was. And the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees, and that's when I fainted. Now, obviously, I am a little perplexed as to why a guy would come out of the woods chanting, meow, meow, meow at people. So once we get down the mountain, I tell my superior I'm going out to search to see if I could find anything in the area. I don't see anyone. So I keep going on for miles. And when I head back, I go off the trail to see if I could figure out maybe where he's coming from. It's almost sunset by this point. And I just sort of write it off because I don't want to be in the woods alone with a man meowing at people. But as I'm headed back, I start to hear something in the distance. I stop and I call out in the immediate area for anyone to identify themselves. But the sound doesn't come closer or get louder. It's just saying, meow, meow, in a monotonous tone. As comical as it sounds, it was almost like that guy on South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get closer to it. It's almost like it's coming from all directions. Eventually, it just sort of fades out, and I end up going back to the welcome sector. I didn't get any further reports. And even though I went back to the area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some kid messing with people, but even I have to admit that it's weird. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to be here for the next post, make sure to hit the subscribe and notification bell to be alerted for the next of the Search and Rescue Woods series. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and if it's evening, well, good luck. And remember, don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just pretend they don't exist.